Our next presenter is Stacy Walters. Ms. Walters is the Regulatory Environmental Administrator for the Fort Worth Water Department. Stacy's responsibilities include oversight and coordination for the utility's environmental legislative activities. Her responsibilities also include oversight of the laboratory testing activities for the FWWD and interacts with other city departments and external agencies. She started her career in environmental testing in private industry prior to joining the city of Fort Worth in 1996. After joining the Fort Worth Water Department, she has worked as a chemist, quality control supervisor, and water quality manager. Her 30-plus years of experience in environmental science has afforded her opportunities in project management, regulatory compliance, and program maintenance as required for federal and state regulations. Please welcome Stacy Walters.
Good afternoon. So today I'm going to talk to you about insights into Fort Worth's approach for the lead and copper rule compliance. As most of you know, we're all preparing as public water systems to go live with the compliance date of October 16th, 2024. So basically, we're all in this together and we're trying to figure this out. So today I want to share with you what Fort Worth has learned. So initially, we focused on areas in the lead and copper rule revisions. Those areas include the service line inventory, which is due October 16th of 2024. We also looked at our water quality, making sure our water is non-corrosive. We looked at what those collaboration efforts would be and how we need to talk to our different stakeholders, whether that's internal or external. And last but not least, we had to look at some budgeting. So in Fort Worth, one of the things we initially determined was that we were going to need some staff. This is a pretty big rule, and it requires a lot of different coordination efforts, so we did add one staff member to our staff to help us with this process as we move through the lead and copper rule compliance. Back in 2021, when the rule became effective, we saw a lot of different things that we were going to have to tackle. And so one of the first things that we all have to do, regardless of whether or not you have lead in your system, is you have to do your inventory. So we started our inventory process back in 2016, looking at all of our meters and detailing the inventory information. We also pulled some old records. We looked at the Tarrant County Appraisal District to help us with some of that. One of the other things we did initially was we went to the different databases to look at our schools and child care facilities to understand potentially how many schools we have in our system, that's public and private, but also our child care facilities. So in Fort Worth, one of the things we did, we divided our child care facilities into two buckets. We looked at it based on commercial. Those are your big box child care facilities, but we also, the rule requires us to test in-home licensed child care facilities. And so when we pulled the list, we saw approximately 60 in-home licensed child care facility, a little bit north of 60. But we started doing this prior to COVID. And what happened during COVID? A lot of child care facilities closed. And so we kept pulling the data about every year just to make sure we understand how the data was changing, what was coming into the system versus what was coming out of the system. And so now we've started to see it stabilize a little bit, but we are seeing an uptick in the number of child care facilities that are now coming back into our system. So also, if you have a population of 50,000 people, you must make your inventory publicly available. And so in Fort Worth, we're also working on our website, which is a GIS map to show customers where lead is available or what the service material may be. We're still working through that. Just some of the things that we had to work through, just looking at how we want to make that information available, how we want our customers to interact with that information. We decided in Fort Worth that we probably were not going to make the inventory publicly available because it has a lot of information on it. and we did not want to create a stir with our public. So we decided maybe we'll just make the information publicly available. So we're working on that as well. And then because we did find lead in our system, we have to do a replacement plan. And as part of that process, that is also due October 16th. So now we're going to move a little bit into compliance. And so we decided in Fort Worth, because schools are not open 12 months a year. Child care facilities are, but not schools. And so you got to figure out, schools start in August. They're closed sometimes between November and December based on the holiday. They come back into school after the first of the year, and then they're out again in May. So you got a compressed schedule that you got to look at it when you're working with your schools to make sure you're trying to sample the schools when they're in operation. If not, you will maybe have a potential for the water to sit in the pipes longer, and so you could see increased levels for lead if you're testing when school is not in service. So that's one of the things you want to think about. The other thing, because of our inventory, we got to go back and look at our tiers. We got to see what services belong in what tier, and as we know in the new lead and copper rule, it requires you to test all Tier 1 sites first before you can move to Tier 2, Tier 3, and so on. So you want to make sure you know exactly where your locations are falling in your tier system. So as part of that, we also have to update that information with TCEQ. And then just notifying our child care in our schools. In Fort Worth, we have approximately 15 ISDs in our service area. That's a lot. It's going to take a lot of coordination. Luckily for us, Fort Worth ISD started testing their schools sometime back in 2014, I think. So we do have some history. We also had some private schools to test. So we understand how much coordination that takes in terms of logistics, how they're going to collect the samples, where they need to collect the samples according to the 3 Ts. All schools must collect a minimum of 5 samples, child care facilities a minimum of 2. So you do have to meet that minimum requirement. Well, schools are a little bit different, and in the school 3T program, it tells you where you have to collect the sample. So for instance, you have to collect the sample in the cafeteria. You have to collect the samples at some of the water fountains. It's specific about where those samples need to be collected. So you want to make sure you're getting all that information together. So what we did with Fort Worth ISD, we created a chain of custody specifically for them, and we listed all their schools, and then they put in what their locations were. So technically, we don't know necessarily where the descriptions are taken. We just know what they put on their chain of custody. And they, in some cases, will know this was the water fountain on the first grade hall, for example. We didn't necessarily know that. And one of the things we did, we wanted to keep a certain amount of anonymity between where they were collecting, because potentially, as we all know, all of our information is subject to public information request. So we want to make sure we weren't delivering information to their students that they had not already done. So we created a sampling plan. They created a sampling plan, as a matter of fact, and then we just work with them through that sampling plan. So in Fort Worth, I'm happy to say that we have collected data or inventory from all of our meters that are in our system. We're approximately 100% complete. And the reason I use the word approximately is because we're growing. And we have new meters coming into our system every day, even when some of the areas aren't built out. So what does that mean? We have an inventory on the public side, but we don't have an inventory material on the private side because it hasn't been built. But we know because of this year, and lead is banned, that it won't ever be lead. So we created another category for that. And as part of our data collection process, we did our GPS coordinates. We looked at the material. We also documented the size of the pipe. We also included a meter number as a secondary ID. And then we were recording whether or not we found any bullheads. And that's where a service is coming out of the meter, but it may be servicing 2 locations, like for instance, an apartment or some townhomes may have an A and a B, but the service is just 1. So we're documenting that as well. So this is what our inventory looks like. We have approximately 288,000 service connections, and we're still growing. We anticipate we may be at 300,000 by the time this inventory is due. The interesting fact is that we only found 10 lead services on the private side. Yes, we were surprised. And this is when we were starting this process. But the downside to this is we have more than 30,000 galvanized services that we cannot say that there was never lead. So what does that do? It puts us in that lead category. We got to notify all those customers that they are galvanized requiring replacement, unless we can prove, maybe when the house was built, looking at TAD and some other information to show that it was not lead. So we also have no unknowns. When we first started our inventory process back in 2016, we did have some unknowns. We went back into our system and said, we need to work through these unknowns. If I cannot send a customer a letter notifying them that they may have lead, it helps us on the front end. So we worked through that process to eliminate our unknowns. And then we have about 55 other, and that number is growing because those are the services where there is no service material for whatever reason. It's a vacant lot, or there is no structure there. So we're capturing that information as well. So because we found lead in our system, we have to do a lead replacement plan. And so as part of that process, we're looking at, as part of our records review, we looked at our county appraisal district. We looked at our ordinances. I pulled the ordinance, and then our ordinance actually refers back to the plumbing code. We looked at our inspection records. We looked at our customer service inspections, any historical records that we may have found in any of our databases. We looked at some capital improvement plans because we know we've been replacing pipe throughout our city. Our field operations, when we have a main break or a leak, when they saw lead, they were immediately removing it, so we were documenting that as well. And then maybe even some customer service agreements as we found them. So this is what the rule says you must include in your replacement plan. You must have a full lead service line replacement procedure. How are you going to replace your lead in your system? You gotta have a strategy for informing your customers. I will say, one of the things that this rule was apparent to me, the communication in this rule is massive. There are so many things that you have to do and notifying the customer on the things that you need to do. I think it's just as important as the rule itself. And then you have a replacement goal you have to identify based on the number of services you found. You have to include a flushing procedure. I don't know if any of you have those, but that's something you must include. What your testing is gonna look like, how do you prioritize those services, and then how do you plan to fund removing those services? So I wanna talk a little bit about prioritization. So one of the things we're doing in Fort Worth is we went and identified all of our services. We mapped them. We looked to see how they were disadvantaged based on the EPA's disadvantage map, and we are going to prioritize those services based on that process, looking at those homes that are potentially disadvantaged. And then for funding, we're looking at all of the options. A couple of years ago, we applied for an EPA grant. We're also looking at the state revolving fund. We applied for SRF funding for our drinking water. So those are just some of the options. I know there's wind money out there for you. If you're interested in that, you just have to make sure you're meeting the minimum requirements for funding. So the other part of this rule is corrosion control. So I think back in 2019, Fort Worth looked at their corrosion control. We did a corrosion control study, which is one of the first things it tells you need to do. And then we submitted our findings to TCEQ to become optimized. And then based on the recommendation from TCEQ in December of 2020, we got that recommendation, and then we finalized our monitoring requirements which are your WQP parameters after the recommendation was approved. And then we finalize our corrosion control SOP. So in Fort Worth, we have 5 drinking water plants. And that's 5 entry points. And one of the things we wanted to do was streamline this process because our operators rotate depending on what plant they may be working. So we want to make sure they understood that whatever corrosion control plan we had in place was the same for all 5 plants. So we looked at the data in excruciating degrees, making sure we understood what was going on with the different plants, because all of our plants have different sources, making sure those sources were accounted for, making sure we account for the seasonal effects of how our lakes are turning over, looking at all that data over the number of years to make sure we understood how our plants need to treat and operate for corrosion control. So the corrosion control treatment options are listed here, and I won't go through all of them, but there was pH, alkalinity, calcium, and then the addition of a corrosion inhibitor. With the lead and copper rule revisions, they removed the calcium option. So I just highlight that in yellow. But in Fort Worth, what we decided, based on our treatment, we were going to treat based on pH control. And so we have a minimum pH that we have for all of our drinking water plants. It is the same throughout the system. So when we look and analyze our WQP parameters, that's something we look for in our system. So when we received our optimized water quality parameters report back in December of 2020, our best option, again, was pH. Our minimum pH in our system is 7.9. That's where we want to operate all the time. The rule allows you to set a minimum, but you don't have to set a maximum. But when you have a maximum pH, that just means you're adding more chemicals, and most of us know that's cost prohibitive sometimes. So we just set our minimum pH. So as part of that, how do you make sure you're meeting your pH goal? Well, we have water quality parameters. So we looked at our monitoring requirements based on our size. We have to monitor all of our entry points, and we have to also monitor certain locations within our distribution system. Because we serve more than 100,000 customers, we have 25 distribution sites, and you can go to 10 under reduce. We're not under reduce. We're still monitoring 25. And honestly, we'll probably continue monitoring 25 just to make sure we understand what's going on in our system, especially as we are growing. Because as your system grows, things change, right? What was a dead end is no longer a dead end, and in some cases, what wasn't a dead end is now a dead end. So it's just another way to verify everything is working well. There are some rules around your water quality parameter monitoring. Systems must report all results of water quality parameter analysis to the TCEQ, and they must be submitted within 10 days following the end of each reporting period. So we're reporting our water quality parameters to TCEQ within that 10-day recommendation. Well, required. It's not a recommendation, it is required. So I talked a little bit about collaboration, and as you can see, these are all the ways we collaborated. We collaborated within our utility. We had to work with other city departments. Of course, we have to work with our state agencies. Then there's your local agencies, and then there are others. And so I just mentioned a couple of things in each one of these categories. Let's say our meter services. When our meter services have to go reset a meter, they're giving us that data. It's going into our GIS system. They're giving us the material that they're seeing in terms of service on the private side and the public side. And if there is lead found, then we move that to our capital project section to look at it to see if it's something they want to issue as a capital project, depending on the number of services, or in some cases, they may use it as a miscellaneous project. So the miscellaneous projects are usually the 1 and 2, maybe 5 services on one street, whereas a capital project could be several services on a street, and they make that determination. And then with our other city departments, our code compliance is one that we've been working with, because in Fort Worth, all commercial child care facilities have to be licensed by our code compliance. That's in our ordinance. So they have a list of all those child care, and their ordinance says they have to test when they come into the system or change of ownership. That's what our ordinance requires. So we actually go and pull our child care list from the state's database, which is Health and Human Services, and then we work with code to make sure those child care show up on their list as well. One of the things we learned when we were doing this is that some child cares are in YMCAs, some child care are in schools. So I don't know that we didn't know that, we just maybe didn't think about that. So that's something you may want to think about when you're working through your child care listing, because what we are trying to do in Fort Worth is when we go test the school, we want to test that child care that's in that school also. Kind of do it at the same time so we don't have to go back to the same location again. But they're under two different categories because you have a child care category and you have a school category. And then, of course, there are the state agencies, of course, the TCEQ, but also the TEA, Texas Education Agency, and the Texas Department of State Health Services. And then, of course, there's the local, because this rule requires you to report all lead testing after October 16th to your public health departments. In Fort Worth, I think we have 5 counties, so that means 5 different health departments that we got to work with. And so that is a requirement as well. So making sure you understand that, and then working with your schools, your ISDs, as well as your private schools. One of the things that we learned, which we didn't necessarily know when it came to schools, and we pulled that list, there are some schools that are state schools. And so we had to make sure we were pulling those schools into this process also. The other thing we learned when we were looking at our schools, our private schools, not all private schools are owned by entities in Texas. So when we were looking at that address, the address didn't register with us because it was out of state, because they could be owned by a corporation out of state. So you want to make sure that you're pulling that data both ways. We pulled it by zip code, or by city, or by ownership. Make sure we're looking at the data in all the ways and make sure we're not leaving any specific school off the system that should be. And then the other thing we were looking at was creating a plumbing contract. So when we have an exceedance, we hope that we don't. But one of the ways that we're approaching this rule is we're looking at worst case. So if we have an exceedance, what do we do? Because that sample may require us to do notification. So how are we gonna know that it's not the water system, but maybe something in the house? Because we know lead just doesn't come from the pipe, it can come from a fixture inside the house. So we are looking at creating some plumbing contracts to help us go in, maybe having a list of certified plumbers to help us go in and figure out why is this house registering high for lead or copper, whichever the case may be. Because as the water utility, we don't necessarily want to be working too much on the private side. We want to help them because this is a public health rule, but we also want to keep a little bit of separation. The other thing that we had to work through, based on our legal folks, we can't work on the private side without permission. So we had to create a form right of entry for the customer to allow us to work on that side. And our legal folks told us that right of entry can only be dedicated for a certain amount of time. And right now, I think we're looking at about 6 months. So when we issue that right of entry to ask the customer to work, we gotta be ready to go. You know, in most cases, not all of this can be done at one time. It takes time. You gotta look at where the service is. You may have to design the project. So these things take time. So one of the things we're making sure we work through is when we know we're ready to go, we got a certain window that we gotta be able to operate. Because after that, our legal folks say, you don't want a right of entry forever. You want to get in and get out and close out that process. So compliance monitoring, what does that mean? This rule now requires a trigger level, which is 10 ppb. We know the action level is 15. We got to change our tiers. But the other thing is now it requires us to do 5th liter sampling. Now that may change with the LCRI, but we got to look to see how we meet this requirement right now. And so the 1st liter will be for copper, the 5th liter will be for lead. And those of you who are public water systems, you know it's hard to get them to fill up 1 liter of water, nevertheless 5. And then how do we logistically deliver 5 liters? How do we get that back? We talked about we need to give them all 5 liters, maybe labeling the bottle 1 through 5 so we know which was the first capture versus what's the 5th capture. All those things are things that you got to work through. And then understanding that this is a find and fix rule. So once you find something, you got to potentially go and look to see how do you fix it. So in the schools and child care facilities, EPA requires us to test under the 3 T's. This is a little bit different than our compliance monitoring, because the compliance monitoring, as I just said, is 1 liter. Schools are 250 mils. So your laboratory needs to understand that they need to have 2 sets of bottles for lead testing, 1 for compliance, 1 for schools and child care, if you're going to meet the 3 T's. And the reason it's important that you meet the 3 T's, because the schools can potentially apply for funding if they have problems in their schools. And the only way they can get the funding is if they met the 3T requirement. And the 3T requirement requires us to have 250 mils, the water unused for 8 to 18 hours. Well, that looks different because our compliance is a minimum of 6. And then schools have a minimum of 5 samples. I talked about that a little bit earlier. There are 2 fountains, 1 kitchen, 1 nursing office, 1 classroom or other use for drinking. Of course, you can always do more than the minimum, but this is what we must do. And then childcare or daycares have a minimum of 2 samples, and that's 1 fountain for kitchen or classroom or other use for drinking. So it's a little bit different than our regular compliance, and you just want to make sure your laboratory understands that, because they want to make sure if for some reason those schools or child care facilities come back with exceedances, they will be eligible to go seek funding for mitigation. So last but not least, we'll talk about the cost impacts. So of course I mentioned staffing. The communication, because of the requirements, means we have to do all of our communication information. That's going to be a cost. Making sure we meet the required language, but also the order in which that language must be provided. Our laboratory testing, who's paying for that? The public water systems are. So that's going to be at a cost too. You got to look at capacity of your laboratories. How do they best work? Our laboratory hates getting samples on a Friday. I hate getting samples on a Monday, because when you schedule testing for a Monday, everybody forgets. Nobody remembers they need to collect samples on a Monday. So we kind of said, okay, we're going to have to look at Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursdays. That's going to be our best opportunity. And maybe on Fridays, if we have to go back and recollect something, that gives us another day to collect. Also, operations. What does this mean for your operations? What other costs will you have? For us, as a mitigation strategy, because for instance, I talked about if you have a customer that has a high lead level, and let's say she's a new mom, how do you talk to her about her exposure? So what Fort Worth is doing, we're ordering pitchers and filters, replacement filters to give to those customers. And that's one of the things that we're doing also with our child care facilities and our schools. If they need it, we have the pitchers and filters, replacement filters for them to mitigate until we can figure out how or why we're seeing a high lead level. Some of it's going to be obvious, but some of it isn't. You're going to have to go in there and figure out what's going on with this home or school or child care. This was a lot, but there is good news. The path forward is you want to make sure you complete your inventory You want to make sure, regardless of whether or not you have lead, TCQ has told us we have to complete an inventory. That inventory must be submitted by October 16th of 2024. So I would say that's the first step you got to take. You want your inventory ready to go to the state on that date. Then if you have lead, you got to create a replacement plan. That's something I'm working on right now. And then making sure if you have more than 50,000 people, a population of 50,000, that website has to go live on October 16th. That's a requirement. That's in the rule. So then as we work through this process, we want to make sure we collaborate. We got our internal stakeholders. We're talking to our field folks. We're also talking to our customer service who take the calls, because who's going to be impacted when all this information goes into effect on October 16th? Customer service. We got to do some scripting, help them understand what's going on, how they need to respond, who they need to ship those calls to, and then as well as our outside entities. One thing we do in Fort Worth is on a quarterly basis, we meet with our health departments. Thank you, Mary, for that. But that's one of the things we do, because we determine early, we don't want to be sitting in front of our health officials when we have problems. We want to create those relationships now to make good, workable collaborations so that when we have concerns, because back in 2014, how Fort Worth decided to test was because a child in their school system had a high lead count, blood lead level count. We immediately contacted our health department because we don't know how to talk about blood. We know how to talk about water. And so because we had that collaboration with them, they immediately stepped in and worked with us to make sure we were given the right information, as well as our regulatories. TCQ has been great. They help us when we need it. We've actually met with our Health and Human Services regional coordinator to explain to her what was going on with the rule, because what we're finding out with our commercial child care facilities, this is not going to be an issue. They've been doing this. But those in-home licensed child care facilities, where you have a person who's keeping maybe a couple of kids in her home, but she's licensed, they're going to be a little bit tricky because they haven't had no experience with this process. So we're actually working with our regional Health and Human Services coordinator to create a letter, joint logo, encouraging our child care facilities to test, to make sure they understand what's going on. And then the next part is develop plans. Of course, there's the lead service rule replacement. We have compliance monitoring. We got school and child care testing, and then communication. And then, of course, there's a reporting aspect to this as well. Not only do we have to make this information available in our CCR report, but in some cases, depending on what levels they're getting, we have to notify the customers immediately. And our laboratory actually is a contract lab for a lot of other cities, so we have to work with them as well. And then record keeping, there's an annual update that we have to do for our testing. There's also, this rule does allow child care facilities and schools to opt out. So we actually created a form, just working through this process, a decline to participate. Because you do have to document that if a child care or school chooses not to collect samples or tests, you got to document that they don't want to participate. That is in the rule. As well as making available those test results to those entities, and then the picture filter distribution. So this is Fort Worth's to-do list by October 16, 2024. Develop our service line inventory. As I said, we're approximately 100% complete, so we feel pretty good about that. One of the things we're doing now is we're verifying our inventory information, because as you know, when you have all these different databases, we have our GPS information coming from our meter services, we have our GIS, we have our records from our capital delivery folks. We're making sure all of our records sync up. one database doesn't say something else. That's what we're doing right now, just making sure we understand if this address is showing, this service material is showing it in all areas that we're collecting the data. We've eliminated our unknown service lines. That's something we chose to do in Fort Worth. It's not required. You can always use the unknown option. But for Fort Worth, we decided we want to work through what we can, and because we didn't have that many unknowns, we went back and looked at that again. We're preparing our website right now for displaying. We had a meeting just a couple of weeks ago, and I can say it looks good. You do want to take into account any citizens that you have that may be colorblind. So we looked at all of that, making sure we're not causing confusion. I think one of the things we discussed internally was we don't want to put red because we don't want to make it seem like, oh, you're bad. So how you choose your colors and how you display that information is up to you, but we looked at all of that information just to make sure we're being friendly with the information, but also it's not intimidating to the customer that's reviewing it. We have developed our lead service line replacement plan. That includes our find and fix protocol. I talked a little bit about having plumbers on site. We worked with our legal department to make sure we had a right of entry. Develop SOP for disturbances of lead, unknown, galvanized downstream of lead. I think this is one of the parts of this rule that really challenges us because our system is so big. When a water is shut off because of lack of payment, when there's a main break, when there's a leak and the water shut off, there are notification protocols that you must make to the customer prior to returning to service. We have main breaks all the time. So that means that the people in the field have to know where those lead services, and for us, it's mostly gonna be galvanized, requiring replacement where they're located, because they gotta make sure we're doing the proper notification. Prepare our sampling plan for schools and registered daycares. Working with my group, we kind of got our sampling plan laid out for the 5 years. And one of the things we recognized immediately when we started working on the sampling plan was that a school year can be over 2 calendar years because it starts in August, it doesn't end until May of the following year. And one of the things that I challenged them on was making sure we can get our schools done in a year. Well, Fort Worth has 120-something schools. And some other districts have 20, 30 schools. It's gonna be tough. Fort Worth, we're gonna have to do over 5 years. There's no way we can get that done. But some of the other schools, we wanna try and move those because one of the examples I gave them, you can have a parent or they can have multiple kids in 2 different schools. And how does the district communicate? We tested one school, but we won't test the other school until year 3. It's a hard communication sale. So we worked through that process to try and make sure we can get our schools done in the school year, not the calendar year, but the school year, which is really 2 calendar years. Update our sampling pool in accordance with new tiers. Once we finalize our inventory, and our goal is to have our inventory finalized and checked twice, by the end of this year, then we can start working on our tier information. Revise our sampling protocols to meet new requirements. If the rule continues to say we have 5 liters of sample that we must sample, we gotta change our sampling requirements. So we actually met with our laboratory a couple of weeks ago and asked them to pull all of the information they had in terms of communication with lead and copper, because the rule also requires us to submit all of our communication to the TCQ for review and approval. So we're working on that as well. And then if you happen to have to work through a contract lab, just make sure you understand what their capability is. As I mentioned, our lab hates to receive samples on a Friday. So you want to make sure you understand what their requirements would be for your monitoring. And then last but not least, develop your public education materials, your notification requirements, making sure you understand what's going on with that so that you will be in compliance for the lead and copper rule effective October 16, 2024. Thank you. And I would like to acknowledge some of my coworkers that are here. Samantha Webster works with me. Samantha, would you stand? And Carla Marquez works with me as well. And then Mary Gugliuzza, she's the communication specialist, but she works with our group extremely close as well. And we collaborate all the time. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
We have a few questions from the virtual audience. Were the GPS locations of all the meters physically taken in the field? What kind of timeline did that look like?
Yes, they were all taken in the field, and we started in 2016, and we finished about 2022, the end of 2022. So about 5 to 6 years is how long it took us to collect all that data.
Great. Does anyone who has a PWS number have to do this lead and copper rule? Is there no exception?
The only people that is excluded from this is transient community. So all community and all non-transient, non-community systems must submit an inventory of all their service lines.
Okay, thank you. Do you have to submit the county health department for schools and daycares only, or the whole system went through?
It's my understanding that you have to submit the information for the schools and childcare.
Okay.
To the county health departments.
Okay. Did you contract your inventory out or do it all in-house? What was the time frame for completion?
Our inventory actually took approximately a little bit more than a year. And I think the challenge was trying to get all of those service lines into that spreadsheet. It was a lot. And so what our GIS folks, because we felt like for us to touch 300,000 plus lines will create a lot of errors. So we worked with our GIS for them to create a program to download that information into that spreadsheet. And it took probably about 6 to 8 months working through that process to make sure what we thought we were seeing was what we were seeing.
Okay, do we only have to create a replacement plan if we identify ISIS, LSLS? I'm not sure which.
Lead service lines?
Okay, I work at a wholesaler and we have very few direct supply customers.
You want me to answer that again?
Yes, ma'am.
So as the LCRR is currently written, a replacement plan is going to be required for anyone who has lead service lines, galvanized requiring replacement lines, or unknowns. We're all still going to wait until we see what LCRI says, but that is how LCRR is currently written.
All right, one last one. Are other identities planning on contracting the work for lead service line out or doing it in-house? Has anyone completed the inventory yet? If so, what was your timeline?
I'll tell you that we have received at least 10 inventories already. So there are people completing it. We have already just heard that Fort Worth is approximately 100% done. So yeah, there are folks who have completed it yet. I don't know if I can speak to how they accomplished it. That's why I love hearing Fort Worth's perspective on how they worked through it.
Well, one of the things that we did was, like I said, we started the inventory process back in 2016, and we did it mostly with in-house staff. And that was also during COVID. That was also during the winter storm. So we had a lot of challenges, including, you know, I think some of the things our meter services folks found were rattlesnakes. They found all kinds of critters. So they had to create a safety plan for themselves as well. So it did take us a little time to work through all of the inventory.
Okay, well, maybe we'll end it there, but I'm around if anyone wants to ask any
And I am
questions.
too. You can see one of the staff here and they can maybe answer some questions. Thank you
so much.